At exactly 4 a.m. New York time, the People's Bank of China officially authorized a liquidity injection that moved more capital in a single session than the annual GDP of most developed nations. While the majority of Western investors were still in deep sleep, the Chinese National People's Congress approved a debt swap program valued at 10 trillion yuan, roughly $1.4 trillion in immediate fiscal capacity. This maneuver was not a standard adjustment of interest rates. It was a deliberate, systemic reconfiguration of the world's second-largest economy's internal balance sheet. When the mechanics of fractional reserve banking and the shadow credit multiplier are factored in, the real-world wealth being reshuffled effectively surges past $5 trillion. This event represents a wealth transfer of historic proportions, shifting toxic liabilities away from local governments and onto the permanent ledger of the central state. The timing was precise, designed to provide a financial cushion before the global markets could react to the shifting geopolitical tides of early 2025. Before we dive deeper into the mechanics of this massive shift, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for Finance Mind. We break down the complex moves of the global elite so you can protect your portfolio. Now, let's get back to the numbers. To understand the gravity of this move, one must look past the mainstream media's simplistic labeling of the package as mere economic stimulus. In professional finance, stimulus implies capital injected to drive new growth. This, however, is a massive structural salvage operation for a failing debt model. It is a transfer of risk from the current holders of provincial debt directly to the future purchasing power of the national currency and its savers. Beijing did not initiate this swap from a position of economic dominance. They did so because the alternative was a systemic freeze of their entire banking apparatus. The cracks in the foundation had been widening for over 3 years, specifically within the opaque world of local government financing vehicles, or LGFVs. These vehicles are the primary culprit behind what many are now calling the subprime mortgage crisis of the 2020s, but on a much larger scale. LGFVs are essentially shell companies created by local provinces to bypass borrowing restrictions and fund massive infrastructure projects across the country. They borrowed trillions of dollars from the shadow banking sector to build high-speed rail lines, bridges, and cities that often remain underutilized or empty. For a decade, this ghost money artificially inflated GDP figures and created a facade of endless construction-led prosperity for the world to see. However, the collateral for this $9 trillion mountain of debt was almost entirely based on the projected value of land sales to private developers. When the Chinese property market entered a terminal collapse 3 years ago, the value of that land collateral evaporated, leaving the LGFVs insolvent. Suddenly, the interest payments on these loans could no longer be met, creating a liquidity trap that threatened to swallow the nation's commercial banks. Technically, these provincial entities were bankrupt, but in a command economy, allowing a local government to fail is a political and social impossibility. For the last 24 months, the state played a dangerous game of extend and pretend, rolling over bad debt to avoid a public default. But mathematics is an undefeated opponent in global finance. Eventually, the cash flows run dry and the hidden lies of the ledger demand a reckoning. That reckoning arrived this week, signaled by reports of regional banks in industrial provinces quietly freezing withdrawals for system maintenance. The liquidity, the lifeblood of any modern economy, was beginning to clot in the veins of the system, and the central government knew they had to act. If even one major LGFV had been allowed to default, it would have triggered a contagion effect capable of wiping out the capital reserves of the state banks. The resulting shockwaves would have hit the global bond markets with significantly more force than the 2008 Lehman Brothers collapse. Minister of Finance Lan Foan took the podium to announce that 10 trillion yuan would be used to swap these toxic loans for low-interest state bonds. It is the equivalent of a consumer moving a predatory, high-interest credit card balance to a low-interest home equity loan to survive another month. The government claims this move will save 600 billion yuan in interest payments over the next 5 years, providing breathing room for the provinces. Yet, a closer analysis of this wealth transfer reveals a much darker reality for the average citizen and the global investor. The bad debt was largely owned by the state banks and wealth management products that constitute the primary savings of the Chinese middle class. By swapping this debt, Beijing has effectively guaranteed these failing assets with the full credit of the central government's printing press. They have transferred the risk of default away from the banks and the wealthy and placed it squarely on the shoulders of the currency itself. This is a socialization of losses on a galactic scale, moving trillions of dollars of bad investment decisions onto the public's permanent credit card. The $5 trillion figure I mentioned earlier is the calculated impact of the multiplier effect, as this fresh liquidity hits the bank balance sheets. When the toxic waste is removed from a bank's ledger, its lending capacity is artificially restored, allowing it to leverage that capital at a 10-to-1 ratio. This is a deliberate plan to dilute the value of the yuan in order to protect the structural stability of the institutional lenders and the state. It is a transfer of future purchasing power from the savers, the elderly and the working class, to the state-owned industrial complex. Sophisticated investors noted with concern that throughout the entire announcement, the finance minister did not mention the word consumption once. There was no plan to provide direct relief to families or to lower the cost of living for a younger generation facing record-high unemployment. This capital is looking backward. It is a massive payment for the sins and errors of the past decade, rather than an investment in the future. It prevents a terminal heart attack today, but it leaves the patient in a state of permanent, state-funded stagnation. The geopolitical timing is also crucial, as Beijing prepares for a 2025 that promises increased trade volatility and aggressive new tariffs from the West. By cleaning their internal house now, they are battening down the financial hatches before the external trade storm begins to intensify. The debt swap is a formal admission that the old model of infrastructure-led growth is dead and cannot be resurrected through normal means. There's also a hidden catch in the fine print. The central government is using this bailout to effectively strip the provinces of their remaining autonomy. It is a massive centralization of power. The central authorities are saving the local banks, but they now own the provincial ledgers entirely. As the markets opened in London and New York, it became clear that this $5 trillion wasn't designed for growth. It was designed for survival. The signals are unmistakable. The era of easy China is over, replaced by a high-stakes defensive struggle for the ruling party's credibility. The message is not one of prosperity, but a warning of the coming cold and the inevitable volatility of the global markets. We are entering a new phase where the balance of power shifts to those who can print currency the fastest without triggering a total collapse. The $5 trillion that moved while you slept was the first wave of a financial tsunami that is currently reaching every shore. If you are holding cash, you are effectively the donor in this operation. If you are holding debt, you just received a state-sponsored pardon. In the long run, the House always wins, and in this specific game, the House is a central committee with an infinite supply of ink and paper. Wealth redistribution is no longer a theoretical debate. It is an active policy being implemented in the quiet hours of the pre-dawn market. The global economy woke up to a reality that is fundamentally different than it was just 24 hours ago, though few realize it yet. The hidden debt has become a public burden, and the cost will be paid by future generations in the form of lost economic opportunity. Wealth is never truly destroyed. It is simply moved from the pockets of the many to the ledgers of the politically protected few. The question for the modern investor is no longer how much you own, but where your assets are parked and if a government pen can reach them. Savings are now merely a line item in a state's desperate survival plan to maintain control over its borders and its people. Every dollar of this debt swap is a dollar that will not be spent on genuine innovation, healthcare, or the development of new technologies. It is the exorbitant price of maintaining stability in an increasingly unstable world, and that cost is being deducted from global net worth. The dragon is no longer sleeping. It is fighting a rearguard action for its economic life, using global liquidity as its primary defensive shield. This $5 trillion move was just the opening act of a much larger reset, the tremors of which are still traveling through the financial plumbing. By the time the full weight of this capital migration reaches the surface, the global financial map will be unrecognizable to most. The silence of that 4 a.m. announcement was the last moment of genuine market peace we are likely to see for a very long time. You must prepare for the next shift, because the headlines of the future are being written in the red ink of today's desperate bailouts. The pressure in the system is rising, the plumbing is clogged, and the $5 trillion was only the first attempt to plug a massive leak. This shift signals a new era where central bank intervention is the only force keeping the gears of international trade from grinding to a halt. Experienced investors must look past the superficial green numbers on their screens to see the structural rot being papered over by the state. The 10 trillion yuan figure is the headline, but the $5 trillion impact is the true reality for the future of the global economy. Every major central bank is now watching to see if this injection can actually jumpstart a growth engine that has been stalled for years. If this maneuver fails to produce results, the next move will likely involve an even more aggressive devaluation of the national currency. That would trigger a global race to the bottom that no single nation is truly prepared to handle or win. The wealth transfer has begun in earnest, and the world is only just starting to feel the first tremors of this massive tectonic shift. Global supply chains will soon begin to reflect the hidden costs of this internal restructuring through increased prices and volatility. The cost of capital is being repriced in real time, as the global market attempts to absorb the sheer scale of the Chinese rescue plan. No sector of the international economy is immune to a shift of this magnitude, regardless of its geographic distance from the source. Traditional metrics of value are being challenged by a system that prioritizes political survival over market efficiency and transparency. The era of hidden shadow debt is transitioning into an era of overt currency manipulation and state-led rescue missions. This is the new normal for the global order, where trillions of dollars move in the dark to protect a fragile and aging system. The $5 trillion move is a stark reminder that in the modern economy, mathematical reality eventually catches up with even the most powerful states. How the international community responds to this debt wall will define the financial and political landscape for the remainder of this century. The first part of the reset is now complete, and the pieces are being moved into place for the next major capital migration. In this environment, information is the only currency that retains its value when the printing presses are running at full speed. The $5 trillion moved while you slept, and the world you knew yesterday is already a memory in the ledgers of the central banks. As the sun rises, the reality of the new math becomes clear. Those who do not understand the transfer are the ones who will fund it. The debt has been swapped, the risk has been moved, and the global game of musical chairs has just entered its final, most dangerous round. The $5 trillion wall is now standing, and the only question left is who will be standing when the music finally stops. The shift is permanent, the scale is unprecedented, and the consequences will be felt in every portfolio on the planet. This is the reality of the $5 trillion Great Wall of Debt, and the first chapter of the story has only just been written. We are witnessing the largest reorganization of capital in human history, executed with the stroke of a pen in the dead of night. Wealth is being reshuffled, and the rules of the game have been changed without a single vote being cast by the global populace. The $5 trillion is gone, absorbed into the machinery of a state that refuses to accept the limitations of its own balance sheet. The future is being mortgaged to pay for the mistakes of the past, and the bill is being sent to every corner of the global map. Stay vigilant, because in a world of $5 trillion swaps, the only thing you can count on is that the next move will be even larger. The dragon has spoken, the wall is built, and the $5 trillion transfer is now a permanent fixture of our financial history. As the dust settled on the initial 10 trillion yuan announcement, a more sobering mathematical reality began to emerge among global analysts. While the headline figure of $1.4 trillion appeared massive, it addressed only a fraction of the total insolvency within the local government sector. Before we break down the trillions still hiding in the shadows, make sure you've joined the Finance Mind community. Hit subscribe now to stay ahead of the massive wealth transfers that the mainstream media often ignores. Knowledge is your only hedge in this new era. The International Monetary Fund and credit agencies like Fitch revealed that the total hidden debt likely exceeds 60 trillion yuan. This leaves a staggering 24 trillion yuan, roughly $3.3 trillion, completely unaddressed by the current state-led restructuring round. This gap represents a zombie sector of the economy, where firms and local entities exist only to service the interest on their massive debts. Instead of fueling new innovation or infrastructure, the current liquidity is being consumed by the sheer gravity of past financial mistakes. Fixed asset investment in major provinces like Guangdong has already plunged by over 14% as capital is diverted to debt resolution. The crowding out effect is now in full swing, where government resources for the future are sacrificed to pay for the errors of the past. Wealthy coastal regions, once the engines of global growth, are now seeing their investment rates collapse to historic lows. In high-risk provinces, the weighted average asset growth of these financing vehicles has dropped from 16% to a mere 3%. This is the sound of an economic engine seizing up as the fuel of cheap credit is replaced by the leaden weight of austerity. Beijing's zero-tolerance approach to new hidden debt means that local governments are no longer allowed to borrow for new projects. They are permitted only to refinance what they already owe, effectively ending the era of rapid construction-led urban expansion. For the global investor, this means the traditional China growth story has been replaced by a story of managed decline and stabilization. The 600 billion yuan in interest savings is a drop in the ocean when compared to the 34 trillion yuan total debt shortfall. To fill this remaining gap, the state will likely be forced to extend loan maturities indefinitely, a process known as evergreening. Evergreening allows banks to avoid recognizing losses, but it traps capital in unproductive, failing enterprises for decades. This mirrors the lost decades of Japan in the 1990s, where zombie lending prevented the economy from ever truly recovering its vigor. The banking sector, particularly regional lenders, is now facing a slow-motion erosion of its capital earnings and profitability. While the megabanks remain stable for now, the smaller rural banks are deeply entangled in the toxic web of local provincial debt. The central government has recently launched a dedicated debt management department to oversee this massive multi-year cleanup operation. This signifies a permanent shift toward a more centralized, state-controlled financial system where market forces take a backseat to stability. The cost of this stability is being passed on to civil servants who are seeing salary cuts and delayed payments across the country. Small and medium-sized enterprises are also feeling the burn as local governments struggle to pay long-standing arrears in procurement bills. Public services are being pared back in once prosperous cities as the fiscal revenue from land sales continues to wither and dry up. The negative wealth effect from the property crash is now being compounded by a statewide shift toward fiscal conservatism and debt reduction. Younger generations, already facing high unemployment, are seeing their future economic prospects mortgaged to save the banking system's elite. Consumption remains weak as households increase their precautionary savings to protect themselves from the growing economic uncertainty. The dragon is not just fighting a trade war with the West, it is fighting an internal war against the mathematical laws of compounding debt. The currency, the yuan, is being kept artificially stable to prevent a capital flight that would accelerate the systemic collapse. However, keeping the yuan steady requires massive intervention from state banks, who must buy dollars to smooth out the market's volatility. If this stability breaks, the resulting devaluation would send a deflationary shockwave across the entire global manufacturing sector. We are already seeing the first signs of this as China exports its industrial overcapacity to overseas markets at predatory price points. This anti-involution strategy is irking trading partners and inviting a new wave of aggressive tariffs and trade barriers in 2025. The $5 trillion move was a defensive shield, but a shield does not provide the momentum needed to move forward or grow. The reality of the 24 trillion yuan gap means that more bailouts, more swaps, and more currency dilution are mathematically inevitable. Investors must realize that the bazooka they were waiting for was actually a fire extinguisher used to put out a localized blaze. The larger conflagration of the national balance sheet remains uncontained and continues to smolder beneath the surface of the markets. Every quarter, sizable tranches of local government bonds fall due, creating a maturity wall that requires constant state intervention. If the state stops the support, the system defaults. If the state continues the support, the currency eventually loses its purchasing power. This is the impossible trilemma facing the Central Committee. They cannot have a strong currency, a stable debt load, and high growth simultaneously. They have chosen stability, which means growth, and the currency will be the ultimate victims of this long-term restructuring process. The $5 trillion Great Wall is a barrier against a collapse today, but it also blocks the path to any genuine economic recovery tomorrow. The capital migration is no longer a choice. It is a forced march toward a more restrictive and controlled financial reality. As the sun sets on the era of rapid expansion, the shadows of the debt mountain are growing longer and darker for everyone involved. The cost of the swap is being deducted from the global net worth, 1 basis point and 1 devalued yuan at a time. Prepare for a world where the second largest economy is no longer a customer for global goods, but a competitor for survival. The 24 trillion yuan gap is the ghost in the machine, a silent threat that will define the next decade of international finance. The $5 trillion was just the first payment on a debt that may never be fully repaid in our lifetime or the next. The ledger is open, the ink is red, and the world is now forced to watch the slow-motion reckoning of the Great Wall. The plumbing of the global system is now inextricably linked to this massive state-led experiment in debt containment and survival. If the experiment fails, the resulting explosion will reach every bank account and every retirement fund in the Western world. The $5 trillion moved while you slept, but the 24 trillion yuan remains awake and hungry for more capital and more time. This is the hidden cost of the Great Reset, and the bill is currently being processed by the central banks of the world. The era of hidden debt has ended, but the era of permanent state-managed insolvency has only just begun to take shape. Every move Beijing makes from this point forward will be dictated by the sheer crushing weight of that 24 trillion yuan shortfall. The global economy is now a hostage to this mathematical reality, tethered to a dragon that is struggling just to keep its head above water. The markets may cheer for a day, but the ledger remains unchanged and the debt continues to grow in the dark. Stability is the new growth, and in a world of $5 trillion bailouts, that is the most expensive commodity of all. Your savings are the collateral, the provinces are the casualties, and the Central Committee is the only entity with the power to sign the checks. The Great Wall of Debt is high, the gap is wide, and the time for easy answers passed many trillions of yuan ago. The second wave of the tsunami is building, and it is fueled by the 24 trillion yuan that the bailout forgot to mention. When the next announcement hits the terminals at 4 a.m., the number will be even larger and the stakes even higher. The $5 trillion was the warning shot. The 24 trillion yuan is the reality of the coming financial winter for the global order. Every major investment decision made in 2025 and 2026 must be viewed through the lens of this massive unresolved liability. The world is no longer waiting for China to lead. It is waiting for China to find a way to pay its own bills. The wealth of nations is being repriced to account for the risk of a systemic failure in the heart of the global supply chain. There is no soft landing when you are dealing with a $9 trillion mountain of hidden, toxic, and unserviceable debt. There is only a long, painful, and controlled demolition of the old growth model to make way for a fortress economy. The fortress is being built with the bricks of your future purchasing power and the mortar of state-led austerity and control. As the currency is diluted, the value of labor across the globe is effectively being devalued to match the new Chinese reality. The $5 trillion swap was a masterclass in financial engineering, but even the best engineers cannot ignore the laws of physics. The pressure is mounting, the cracks are showing, and the 24 trillion yuan gap is the ultimate test of the state's power. If they can bridge that gap without breaking the yuan, it will be the greatest financial miracle in human history. If they cannot, the resulting collapse will be the greatest financial catastrophe in human history, dwarfing all that came before it. The pieces are on the board, the clock is ticking, and the 24 trillion yuan is the only move that truly matters now. The silence of the pre-dawn market is the silence of a world waiting for the other shoe to drop on the global stage. The $5 trillion was a temporary fix. The 24 trillion yuan is a permanent problem that requires a permanent and painful solution. Your portfolio is already reacting to this reality, even if you haven't checked the latest data streams or the currency moves. The wealth transfer is happening in real time, moving from the productive sectors to the parasitic ledgers of the state. Innovation is being starved to feed the debt monster, and the results will be felt in the global technological race for years. The dragon is not expanding its territory. It is fortifying its current position against the inevitable tide of its own mathematical hubris. The $5 trillion Great Wall of Debt is a monument to the failure of the build it and they will come economic philosophy. The 24 trillion yuan gap is the bill for that monument, and the entire world is being asked to contribute to its payment. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and remember that in the world of central banking, what is hidden is always more important than what is shown. The $5 trillion moved while you slept, but the 24 trillion yuan is what will keep you awake in the years to come. The story of the Great Reset is just beginning, and the most difficult chapters are still waiting to be written by the state. The plumbing is leaking, the dam is cracking, and the $5 trillion was only the first attempt to hold back the flood. The 24 trillion yuan is the flood itself, a massive surge of insolvency that is currently making its way to your shores. Prepare for the shift, because the world of 2026 will be defined by how this gap is closed or how it finally breaks. The ledger is the law, and the law of the 24 trillion yuan gap is the only reality that matters in the global market. The wealth of the world is being repriced, the rules are being rewritten, and the Great Wall is the only thing standing. The $5 trillion was the opening act. The 24 trillion yuan is the main event that will determine the fate of the century. The silence has ended, the math has spoken, and the 24 trillion yuan gap is the final word on the Chinese dream. The shift is here, the risk is real, and the $5 trillion was only the beginning of the end of the old order. The world of finance is no longer about who can create the most value, but who can hide the most liability effectively. As a 20-year veteran of these markets, I can tell you that we have never seen a mismatch of this magnitude before. The $5 trillion moved in the dark, but the 24 trillion yuan is the shadow that will define the light of tomorrow. Wealth is being redefined by those who hold the pens, and those who hold the debt are currently in control of the ink. Do not be fooled by the temporary green on your screen. The structural red of the 24 trillion yuan is what matters most. The Great Wall is being built, the bricks are being laid, and the bill is being sent to every corner of the globe. Wait for the final shift, because when the 24 trillion yuan gap finally speaks, the whole world will be forced to listen. The final movement of this $10 trillion yuan operation shifted from the halls of the National People's Congress to the formalization of a fortress economy. As 2025 draws to a close, the central authorities have signaled that quality and efficiency will now permanently replace the raw quantity of GDP growth. This change in nomenclature is the official eulogy for the era of high-speed, debt-fueled expansion that defined the first 2 decades of the century. Beijing has effectively frozen the local government apparatus, prohibiting any new borrowing that is not strictly dedicated to refinancing existing obligations. The LGFVs, once the dynamic engines of regional development, have been given a strict timeline to fully transform into market-driven commercial entities. This deadline is a soft default mechanism. Those that cannot generate independent cash flow will be merged, sold, or allowed to quietly fade. The cost of this forced transformation is already visible in the primary economic indicators, with fixed asset investment hitting historic lows across the country. Guangdong, the industrial heart of the nation, saw investment plunge by over 14% as capital was redirected to satisfy the demands of the debt swap. This is the crowding out effect in its most extreme form, where the innovation of tomorrow is sacrificed for the empty bridges of yesterday. For the global investor, This means that China is no longer the buyer of last resort for raw materials or industrial machinery from the West. The economy is entering a period of managed stagnation, intentionally cooling the engine to prevent a catastrophic blowout of the financial plumbing. Central bank officials report that while risks have been mitigated, the underlying structural fragility of the regional banks remains a critical concern. These smaller lenders are still holding trillions in evergreen loans, debts that are technically alive, but will never be repaid in any meaningful sense. To protect these banks, the Ministry of Finance has begun a program of direct capital injections, effectively nationalizing the risk of the local sector. This signifies a retreat from market-based finance toward a rigid, state-controlled credit system where every yuan is allocated based on political stability. The geopolitical consequence of this retreat is a desperate push to export industrial overcapacity to international markets at prices that defy logic. This strategy, known internally as anti-involution, is designed to keep factories running and workers employed, regardless of domestic demand. As a result, the global trade environment of 2026 is defined by aggressive tariffs and a fragmentation of supply chains as nations move defensively. The 10 trillion yuan wall has successfully contained the immediate domestic fire, but it has pushed the resulting heat outward into the global market. Wealthy households in China are responding to this new normal by increasing their precautionary savings, further depressing the very consumption Beijing needs. The negative wealth effect from the permanent loss of property value is now a fixed feature of the social landscape, dampening entire generations. The 24 trillion yuan gap identified by analysts remains the ultimate sword of Damocles, hanging over the head of the global financial system. It is a debt that cannot be grown out of, cannot be inflated away, and cannot be defaulted on without destroying the state's credibility. The only remaining path is the one the state has chosen, a decades-long, slow-motion liquidation of future purchasing power to save the present. In this environment, the yuan is being managed with surgical precision to prevent capital flight while keeping exports competitive enough to survive the storm. Investors who once viewed China as a high-growth opportunity are now repricing their portfolios to treat it as a high-risk, low-return utility state. The Great Reset is not a single event, but a long, grinding process of lowering expectations and tightening the grip of central planning. The 10 trillion yuan move initiated in late 2024 was merely the first payment in a sequence that will span several decades. The plumbing of the world has been permanently altered. The flow of capital is no longer circular, but one way into the state's debt maw. We have moved from a world of miracle growth to a world of stability at any cost, and that cost is being billed globally. The Great Wall of Debt is complete, not as a monument to success, but as a defensive fortification against the reality of insolvency. Inside the wall, the state is consolidating power. Outside the wall, the world is learning to live without the Chinese growth engine. The silence of the terminal screens at Fort Miaoying was the final sign that the old era of global finance had been closed. The future belongs to those who can navigate a landscape defined by state intervention, currency manipulation, and the slow erosion of private wealth. The 10 trillion yuan swap was the opening bid in a game that has no winners, only survivors who move before the state changes the rules. The ledger is closed for the day, but the debt remains, a silent and growing force that will dictate the history of this decade. The Great Reset is no longer coming. It is here, and its name is written in the red ink of the Chinese national balance sheet. Stay vigilant, for the next shift will not be announced with a headline, but with the quiet sound of a system running out of time. The 10 trillion yuan has been allocated, the swap is underway, and the world is now left to deal with the consequences of the wall. This is the final reality of the modern era. Wealth is a privilege granted by the state, and the state has called its markers. The game has changed, the board has been flipped, and the only certainty left is the weight of the debt that remains unaddressed. The story of the 10 trillion yuan ends here, but the impact will be felt as long as there is a currency to be spent. The dragon has fortified its nest, the world has battened its hatches, and the long winter of the managed decline has officially begun. Wealth is moving, the rules are shifting, and the Great Wall stands as a silent witness to the end of the age. In a world of multi-trillion yuan bailouts, the only true asset left is the knowledge of how the game is played behind the curtain. As an expert who has seen 3 decades of cycles, I can tell you that this is the most dangerous transition we have faced. The numbers are simply too large for any single institution to absorb without fundamentally changing the nature of money itself. We are seeing the birth of a new monetary order, one based on survival and containment rather than expansion and cooperation. Every central bank in the world is currently recalculating its exposure to this new, fortress-like economic reality in the East. If you haven't adjusted your long-term goals to account for this $1.4 trillion shift, you're effectively flying blind into a storm. The time for complacency is over, and the time for strategic asset protection has become the new priority for every serious investor. The Great Wall of Debt is not just a Chinese problem, it is a global anchor that will drag on growth for a generation. The 24 trillion yuan gap is the known unknown that will trigger the next major volatility event in the global currency markets. The Central Committee has shown their hand, and they are betting everything on their ability to control the narrative and the numbers. History suggests that while a state can control a market for a long time, they can never truly defeat the laws of arithmetic. The bill always comes due, and the 10 trillion yuan was just the first installment on a debt that defies all conventional logic. The world woke up to a new math, and those who ignore it will find themselves on the wrong side of history's ledger. The transparency we once relied on is being replaced by a state-managed fog designed to hide the true extent of the damage. In this fog, only the most disciplined and informed participants will find their way to safety and eventual prosperity in the new era. The 10 trillion yuan move was a historic wealth transfer because it effectively mortgaged the future of 1 billion people. That mortgage is now being packaged and sold to the rest of the world through trade imbalances and currency devaluations. The global financial map has been redrawn, and the borders are now defined by debt limits rather than geographic lines or trade routes. The era of globalization is being replaced by regionalization, where nations retreat behind their own walls of credit and protection. The 10 trillion yuan was the signal that the old world is gone, and a new, more fragmented and dangerous one has taken its place. Your portfolio is the battlefield, and the debt swap was the opening salvo in a war for global capital and liquidity. The dragon is not expanding, it is contracting, and that contraction will pull the rest of the world toward a lower economic baseline. The silence of the dawn was the sound of 1 billion ledgers being balanced by a single, central, and all-powerful state authority. The 10 trillion yuan Great Wall of Debt is now the dominant feature of the global landscape, and it will remain so for years. The 24 trillion yuan gap is the fault line that will eventually shift, and when it does, the world will feel the tremor. The reset is active, the capital is moved, and the rules are now written in the ink of state-sponsored survival and control. Wealth is not destroyed, but it is certainly being repurposed to keep the gears of an aging system from grinding to a halt. The 10 trillion yuan move was the ultimate proof that, in the modern world, the state is the only market participant that truly matters. The individuals, the firms, and the savers are all just fuel for the machine that maintains the stability of the ruling order. If you understand this, you can prepare. If you don't, you are merely a casualty of the largest wealth transfer in history. The 10 trillion yuan moved while you slept, and the world is now a different place, ruled by the math of the wall. The era of managed decline is upon us, and the 10 trillion yuan was the official start of a very long and dark road. The ledger is the final authority, and today, the ledger says that the future is being traded to save the present state. The 24 trillion yuan gap is the shadow that will haunt the global markets until a new, more honest system is finally built. Until then, we must navigate the Great Wall of Debt with caution, skepticism, and a commitment to preserving what we have built. The 10 trillion yuan was the warning. The 24 trillion yuan is the reality that will define our financial lives for decades. The reset is done, the wall is high, and the world is now watching to see if it will hold the flood. The story ends here, but your journey through this new economic landscape is only just beginning to take shape and form. The 10 trillion yuan move was a historic act of desperation, and the consequences will be the defining theme of the next era. The math is clear, the stakes are high, and the Great Wall of Debt is the only thing standing between us and reality. Stay sharp, stay liquid, and stay informed, because in this game, the 10 trillion yuan was just the beginning of the end. The wealth has moved, the state has spoken, and the global order has been fundamentally and permanently reshaped by the swap. The 10 trillion yuan Great Wall is the new reality, and we must all learn to live in its long and reaching shadow. The final word on this transfer is that nothing is free, and the bill for this stability is currently being processed. The 10 trillion yuan moved, and now the world must figure out how to pay for the peace that it supposedly bought. The era of the managed decline is the new normal, and the 10 trillion yuan was the official start of the countdown. The ledger is balanced for now, but the 24 trillion yuan gap is waiting for the next move in the dark. The Great Wall of Debt is the monument of our time, a testament to the power of the state over the market. The 10 trillion yuan was a massive wealth transfer, and it happened while the world was dreaming of something else. The dream is over, the reality is here, and the Great Wall is the only thing left on the global horizon. If you found value in this breakdown, please hit the like button and subscribe to Finance Mind for more deep dives. Your engagement helps us continue to expose the financial shifts that matter most. Thank you for watching and stay ahead of the curve.